Going to get this next session underway. This is still under the umbrella of globalisation, and this is Convergence, the elephant in the room, and this is being facilitated by Michael Wigley. He's quite a big wig at a firm called Wigley & Co, as you can imagine by the name connection. Good friend of mine through various legal associations, a very generous lunch host, I can tell you, if you get the opportunity, do take that up. And very experienced in all matters to do with regulatory, legal affairs and IT. So Michael will facilitate the session. Please welcome him.
Okay, two news stories to start to really scope the idea of the competition part of convergence. So there's a bunch of stuff to do with convergence, broadcasting, media, telco, etc., content standards like we talked about last session. But I'll start with convergence and a couple of stories in the papers. So here's the telco rag comms day, and that's Rick Ellis, used to run TVNZ, and he's talking about what he's doing with Telstra in yesterday's paper, and he says that a number of people are saying that over-the-top players are going to kill the world, but actually he thinks the traditional free-to-air and pay TV channels are still going to rule. So for those that don't know what over-the-top players are, they're the people that don't actually go through broadcasting companies or telcos like Sky or TVNZ or Telecom or Telstra Clear. They're the folks that come in from the side. So great example is iTunes, Netflix and the likes. And so what he's basically saying is, hey, the traditional guys are still going to rule the world. The new entrants like Netflix, and he actually gives that Netflix as an example. It's only got about 1% of the turnover of the free-to-airs and the pay TVs. They're just the little players. The big players are going to stick around. Telstra, of course, they're half owners of one of the main pay TV channels in Australia, and obviously as a telco they've got very strong interest in running running content. So I guess what this tells you is that a guy that's inside the business, inside the big incumbent, the monopoly in Australia, is saying, hey, the likes of us are still going to win in the content space as against the others. But then a few days earlier, this is in an English newspaper, little report, Virgin Media, saying that the decision by the Competition Commission, that's the UK regulator like the Commerce Commission, more or less, the decision is shit. And what the decision was, they reversed their view. Initially they said, hey, the likes of Sky, I've got to talk a bit about Sky here. It ain't just about Sky, it's also about other organisations too. So we had a great example this morning from your example with Google, with a non-price issue where they get information which is confidential, and we all, as we read about it in the newspapers here, all about, hey, they're misusing our information and it's privacy concern. But hey, what are they doing? They're taking the data and they're spreading their footprint and they're using it for controlling the market or antitrust or competitive purposes. So this ain't just about Sky necessarily. It can be other organisations, it can be Google and the rest of them. So the Competition Commission has come out and said in the UK, look, actually we think that the likes of Netflix and the rest of them are actually going to be a restraint on the traditional providers like pay TV channels such as Sky, so we're not going to regulate. Okay? Now, they're two different countries, all right, but it's they're similar enough countries to say, actually I think somebody's probably wrong there, one or t'other, not sure which. So there's some element of debate about it. And a lot of this comes back in terms of assessing competition, the difference between not absolutely separate, but investment and competition. So if you're a Sky TV, or if you're a Google, or if you're a Microsoft, you're going to be saying, hey, look, we started this business 15, 20 years ago. We did it out of a garage. We were entrepreneurs. We've made it go really well. We need to be incentivised, and future players need to be incentivised to make money. And if you start regulating us so that we don't get our monopoly rents or our big profits from being a great big monopoly, that's not great for the marketplace. And you know, hey, they've got a point there. It does make sense. And then there's a bunch of other people who are saying, well, hang on a second, but actually competition is best for end users, for consumers, and it's better to do that. Now, one of the things that regulators do, well, they will balance those two things. They will try and work out something that gets a measured balance between the two. Not an easy thing. The New Zealand regulatory framework for, again, still just dealing with competition. So we have the thing called the Commerce Act, which is along there, that's all industries, and it's a generic thing. And so in New Zealand, examples in the telco field, well known as 0867, data tails, the interconnection dispute between Clear and Telecom, etc. Broadcasting field, great example is Sky TV, the pay TV, being given permission or clearance to buy, what's the channel? Prime, thank you. To buy Prime, free-to-air, right? So that obviously raises potential competition issues as they spread their footprint. They got permission under the Commerce Act. Quite wrong in my view as a matter of law, but they got it. So it covers there. And then what is said quite often is actually general competition law doesn't work for some industries. So the telco industry is a good example. Obviously there's the Telco Act. And should we have a special legislation for broadcasting and media? And there ain't none. Well, there's a wee bit. First of all, there's some technical stuff. And secondly, there's some suggestion the Telco Act actually extends out to media. Whether it does or not, I don't think that's actually going to happen in practice. So that's the current scenario. Great straw man is that the Aussies a few months ago released this report, the Convergence Review, talking about this very issue. What are we going to do about the issue in terms of the various industries, media, broadcasting, telco, etc., converging internet? How are we going to handle that? So good straw man. Key conclusion there. Content has the potential to be the new competition bottleneck, and so a regulator, this is a new regulator, communications regulator, covers the field, has to have the necessary powers to promote fair and effective competition. And a couple of things to pull out of that. First of all, potential for a bottleneck. So previously, for example, the phone network, the copper network was regarded as the bottleneck, and maybe that moves to content. But it has the potential, it's not certain yet. And secondly, that the regulator has to have powers to deal with it. So this is what the review recommended in Australia. First of all, move away from detailed regulation. So in this country, for example, broadcasting, radio spectrum tends to be quite tightly defined. Telco tends to be more principled based. And so it's moving more towards a principled base, a bit like the Privacy Act, which is a bunch of principles. It's not just detail, it's principled. And the great beauty about that is it enables fluidity and flexibility as things evolve for regulators and others to make the right decisions. And it's kind of crazy, for example, to have telco having a principled-based approach, flexible to meet the needs of the market, playing also in different fields which are more inflexible. Better to have two combined. And then the regulator there should also in Australia, and this is the model that the Telco Commissioner has here, should be able to make rules. So our Telco regulator, Telco Commissioner can do that. He or she can decide that mobile termination rates are going to be regulated, that LLU is going to be regulated, that roaming is going to be put in, that, and so on and so forth. And then once that decision is made, then it's to implement. There's two steps. And I guess there's a key point there, which is that if you have a regulator, doesn't mean you're going to have regulation. It's just that if the regulator reckons it's a good idea, based on market assessment, etc., based on careful consideration, and yes, there would be regulation. So these are the likely folks that be regulated, a bunch of them. This new firm, Red Alerts, the Labour Party blog site, now run by David Farrar, the conservative blogger and defamer of Jamie, and his personal love that he highlights in relation to cats. So in these changes, what do you do? What do you do in terms of social media when we're talking about regulation? It seems a bit crazy to have the sort of regulation that the Australians are talking about in terms of both the likes of YouTube, Geek Zone, Kiwi Blog, etc., and also new entrants, QuickFlix, which is just a tiddler. Should they be subject to regulation? Well, the solution that the Australians have come up with is basically said, hey, if you're big enough to be regulated, we'll do it. If you're Foxtel, if you're Sky, we'll regulate you. If you're a tiddler, we won't. And there'll be a $1 break-off point, which maybe that's a good idea, maybe not. Here's the issues that Convergence raises. Competition we've dealt with, content standards last session, the BSA, etc. Spectrum on its own should be all together perhaps. Telco talked about diversity. There's an interesting one. Diversity, media diversity, multiple voices, plurality. You've got to avoid the situation where one or two players capture the media market. And lots of countries overseas have regulation which stops that, and we don't. The acquisition, for example, by Sky of the Prime TV channel, I doubt would have taken place if we had plurality provisions. So that's all about civil liberties, openness, etc. I picked on Sky there, but could be anything else. Nobody talks about this much, but hey, pretty easy for a big player to come along and rule the world when it comes to UFB. But nobody's talking about it. This government's not terribly keen on regulation. I suspect this may be a danger area for them. How do you say that, Susan? Cycles, things don't change. You know, we got operational separation a few years ago. Telecom pushed the boundaries too much, further than they should have. Bit daft, really. They got operational separation. We go backwards and forwards, but everything stays the same. I reckon we'll have regulation in the space. Doesn't matter how much we talk about it in terms of convergence, probably in about 2 or 3 years. It's cycles, cycles, cycles. Okay, that's the introduction. Anyone want to talk, comment? Okay, we're done.
Disruptive technologies within the Crown Fibre. Again, I'm harping on about multi-point to multi-point multicast. What this will enable is that everybody can become the broadcaster in the same amount of power effectively as Sky, subject to the licenses and everything like that. This is a technology which, again, will, if we implement it on the Crown Fibre, will enable not just telemetry, but video streaming, live stations, and that side of things. So the Sky media will take a rooted multicast approach, which has been facilitated in the bitstream definitions, but the next stage of that will be where everybody can become a broadcaster using multicast technologies, be it of environmental data, be it of Trade Me, be it of Radio New Zealand. This is what's going to happen. So you're going to have this huge diversity. So there's another wave, if you like, coming on in terms of reticulation of this data at very low cost. So I just wanted to add that the mainstream medias are going to have their technology positioned within Crown Fibre, but the public are going to be able to exploit, if you like, the full capabilities of what the internet has been designed to provide a long time ago. And I think that that is relevant to how, you know, what you're talking about here in terms of control of speech or control of discipline, if you like, in the way in which this is handled.
Thank you. That was a useful handover. My name is Jordan, and I'm just speaking with my own hat on. I wear other hats, but they aren't very relevant for this. Michael, I really like the fact you showed that slide about, was it Virgin Media complaining about the Competition Commission in the UK not deciding to intervene? Because the thing about that, and the big gap I think we've got here, is no one can do that here. No one can really make that decision under legislation that is designed to look specifically at the media sector. And I think the fact that we've got a Commerce Commission that can either use, you know, a Commerce Act that isn't working the way the Commission itself doesn't want it to, because of the failure of the Section 36 litigation on the one hand, and a Telco Act that lets them do some things but only around the edges, maybe subscriber video on demand but maybe not, is actually insanity. So I think that the biggest risk we've got in New Zealand is that the only people who have a mandate to keep an eye on these things, these broadcasting markets, are officials. And officials are lovely people. There are some of them in the room. But it isn't their job to tell the government that the government is wrong and to do something about it anyway, which is why we need to look at new legislation that gives a division of the Commerce Commission, whether it's the Telco Commissioner with an expanded role or something else, the mandate to at least look at these markets, to at least assess where convergence is causing problems, and if problems are emerging, to solve them, because at the moment no one can solve them. And the other point I just want to raise and see if there's any further interest in the room is, we're one of the few countries with no media ownership regulation and with massively concentrated ownership in print and television media markets. That makes me uncomfortable. Does it make anyone else uncomfortable?
Thanks, Jordan.
Yes, it makes me feel uncomfortable. I was trying to make sense of the idea of convergence and competition in terms of what exactly does it mean for me. I mean, if it was all wall-to-wall Netflix, then I guess you might be forgiven if you thought it really doesn't matter because it's all stuff and it's out there and it's stuff you go to the cinema for or whatever, but perhaps not of riveting importance. But if you ask the question, well, do I want Fox News after its performance in the States and discovering that it has no honest political reporting, it has no honest financial reporting, as much part of the global financial catastrophe that we've just had and the next one that's going to come along, then, and it's the Fox Newsiness of the monopolies involved in digital convergence are going to squeeze out any possibility of an alternative voice, voices that can afford to transmit in this converged network, or voices that will be even allowed to transmit and compete with bandwidth shaping and the rest of it that an unregulated, regulated dominant media might well impose through integration with telcos and the integration of content with deliveries being the telco's dream, basically. They'll do it one way or the other. So if I mean, it's about speaking what the questions and what the issues are. It's about speaking about that as much as anything. Otherwise, it's just dry as toast, and we can all forget about it.
Andy Linton, not wearing my Internet NZ hat in the same way Jordan, I think, isn't wearing his. Your slide, which had the big boot of Sky on top of UFB, I think it was like the last of the one just before that. Actually, I hadn't thought of it that way, but it actually made me think a little bit about the way the UFB whole business is structured. You know, there's another area where we need some shaping and some control over this. The cost of becoming a retail service provider on this network and the barrier to doing that is extremely high. You've got to actually put money on the table to be one, and there's a whole set of constraints there. And I'm very concerned that, you know, the way this whole thing has been structured is for the benefit of the large players in this marketplace, and that they're going to be in the position to say this is what you're going to see and what you're not going to see. So it may not be Sky with its boot directly on the UFB, but it may be Sky in collaboration with half a dozen service providers sitting on top of that who have their boot on top of it. So there may be an insole in there, but I think there's a real risk in there that we end up with something with the UFB which is just structured to deliver more couch potato making material for us.
I mean, the UFB, of course, is set up as a open access platform, so the theory is that it can't be gamed and misused by players. But the reality is that having an open access platform, that kind of does reduce some of the gaming, but it's exceptionally difficult to eliminate it. And the experience, and I've been personally involved in a few things very closely in the last few years to do with the undertakings, they're really rather easy to game. And if you are a Sky, you'll definitely have your strategy people sitting there at the moment working the way through it. If you are a Chorus, you'll definitely be having the strategy people sitting there working their way through it. You'll definitely be having Sky and Chorus people talking to each other. When you've got profit-driven organisations, they are totally incentivised to do it. Yes, as you said, it may be that there ain't going to be any problems because there's new players. There is clearly some competition benefits in having a new platform like this, but there are also potential challenges that need to be worked through. And I just really highlight that I do think that if you have a hands-off regulatory scenario with broadcasting, etc., as at the moment, funny enough, it may bounce back on UFB. Anyway, sorry, who was... Oh, Claire.
Claire Curran, Labour's spokesperson for communications and IT and broadcasting. So I'm the Convergence spokesperson. And one of my pleas is, could we please come up with a new name so that we don't have to call it both things? But I don't think it's any secret that I've got pretty strong views on these things, and that Labour does as well, and that we see that that there is a converged environment already, and that there are, as a result, some clear regulatory issues that aren't being addressed. We're in an environment where there's a government that doesn't see that those issues are there and aren't addressing them. And we're seeing the impact of that right now, particularly in the broadcasting environment, with the demise of our public broadcaster, TVNZ7, and with the imminent launch of Igloo with Sky. And one of the, and I'm not going to comment in too much detail about that, but the thing about this session is that it's what's heartening for me is that, you know, I'm hearing people say there are issues. One of the problems that we have is that the industry, both industries, particularly in telecommunications, doesn't speak out publicly that often about these issues. It comes up at conferences, but it doesn't, and when they do, they get put to one side and say, oh, well, you've just vested interests, you've got an interest in this. What we need is more advocacy from whether they're individuals, groups, who are speaking very strongly and consistently. And what we see, not just in this industry, not just on these issues, but with a whole lot of issues out in our community at the moment, is that there's fear of speaking out because you might get affected. And you've got to get over that, because otherwise it won't change.
30 seconds. 30 seconds. Thank you.
Andy. Andy Neal. I wondered if I could just talk about convergence in a different sector for a second. And I'm interested in the publishing sector. So I'm working in a library context, and there's a lot of...
Does it relate to this convergence?
It is convergence within the publishing sector. Is it?
But is it to do with media, online, telco, etc.?
I wouldn't say it's telco, no.
Probably better stick clear, I think.
It's just about telco, is it?
30 seconds. Off you go. 30 seconds.
Oh, I was just going to talk about what we're seeing internationally with the likes of Amazon and the squeeze within the publishing sector. And there's a lot of talk about, you know, within the New Zealand industry and globally, and the impact that's having on the sector in New Zealand. I was just interested in people's comments on that area of convergence.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I let you run. Sorry about that. I mean, clearly the likes of Amazon and what they're doing fits just as much into this territory. So it's not, it is that wide.
Right,
My apologies for trying to cut you off.
Peter Harris. I guess what I see is that the real difficulty is a coupling between the content industry and the delivery industry. So I mean, even, you know, we're talking about UFB and broadcasters and so on. Really speaking, they're all delivery agents, and the content. The issue really is that we've got a coupling between the content providers entering special agreements with whatever the delivery mechanism is, and locking out from other delivery mechanisms. So maybe what we should be looking at is looking at a way to decouple the content industry from the delivery mechanisms so that it can be a level playing field, so that it can be delivered by whatever means is possible.
Yes, because the story that Alice from Telstra, Claire, he distinguishes over-the-top providers, the likes of Netflix and iTunes and so on, from traditional broadcasters. But actually it's a lot more complicated than that, isn't it? There's content providers, there's the studios in the US and so on and so forth. So it's a more complicated story.
It's when those, the content providers, if they enter special agreements with the transmitters, the broadcasters, and don't let it get onto, say, Netflix or these other services, then you have a problem of equity over the delivery systems.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tim Gordon here from the University of Auckland. Just looking at that...
Where the hell are you?
I'm right here.
Hello.
Hi. You had a slide up earlier about the sort of areas which potentially do need regulation with this convergence issue. One area which is, it's not in legislation but is highly regulated, are the actual technical standards for broadcasting of television and radio. So Freeview is based on a DVB platform and radio on several, and then mostly analogue in New Zealand. But I guess what I'm saying is that there doesn't seem to be one defined standard for delivering this content over the internet. So I guess we're saying before, splitting the content from the broadcaster, there may be several content providers but not all compatible. For example, with a set-top box or something, you may have a hook to your television. So if we sort of accept that there will always be one screen in a living room, it may be that we end up with several boxes all connected to several different services, like we've seen with, I guess, potentially ebooks and other types of online media that won't be compatible with each other, and whether that's an area worth regulating in this convergence issue as well.
Yeah, so there's a wide range of ways in which the marketplace can be controlled and monopolised and skewed by various techniques, such as walled garden type kit, walled garden services, net neutrality issues, data caps, giving one player free gigabit coverage as opposed to others, etc., etc. The example this morning of use of information simply within the walled garden of Google. Great example. Who's next? Any microphones kicking around?
This is very much a me hat as opposed to who I work for hat. In terms of, you haven't really touched on the frequency broadcasting for radio, which, to me at least, looking at the technology that's becoming commonplace now, these sort of cogent networks that we talk about, or intelligent cognitive radio cell networks that are coming out. There seems to be a very heavy reliance, and especially touching on what was talked about at yesterday's conference at Intact, reliance on frequency regulation as a control for a lot of these media. That doesn't make any sense in this sort of technology atmosphere that we seem to be walking into. How do you see the traditional role of, say, radio broadcast frequency spectrum regulation in say 5 years' time? Because I think it's going to converge on just the same way as we think of wired transmission.
Any comments on that? I mean, my own personal view is that, by the way, the Australians are moving towards an auction-based spectrum system like we've got, which is regarded as state-of-the-art, although goodness knows it's been butchered to death by public sector and politicians. But in theory, in its pristine beauty, it's in theory pretty good. But the idea of having that handled separately from the other functions kind of doesn't make sense. A simple example is obviously cellular mobile. Why isn't the Telco Commissioner or the likes involved in dealing with spectrum? There have already been problems when they've got two separate agencies handling it. New technologies coming along that's kind of make it easier as well, easier to use spectrum, harder to use spectrum. Who's next?
Hi, I'm Miles from Save TV D7. So I come from a television position in terms of, but obviously television is moving onto the internet, and that's convergence. And we're looking at a future where television programs will not have a funding mechanism apart from via government, because ISPs are not big on paying for content at all. As far as I know, I don't know of any ISPs who pay to put money towards websites. And so how are we going to see New Zealand programs on screen in the future, apart from through New Zealand on Air? We're going to see plenty of Disney, we're going to see plenty of programs that are made overseas, but we won't be able to download, New Zealand programs in amounts that, are substantial or, diverse. We'll get the commercial programs that we're already seeing. And so how do we, and then the other side of convergence is, apart from the regulation, is the funding of the content. Who's going to pay for it? And so my idea, or it's not my idea, it's an idea of several other people that I'm exploring, is the idea of making a 1% levy on commercial broadcasters and the broadcasters of the future, the ISPs. Obviously, I'm from television background, the commercial channels are not keen on the idea. And I expect that ISPs are not keen either, but I would be interested to know whether that is true or not. But certainly it seems to me one of the most likely feasible ways of getting New Zealand content, be it radio, music, video, obviously, and also then the whole website convergence between them.
Okay, thanks. So this is kind of in scope, if you like. For example, that Australian report has quite an extensive section on funding of local content and some of the issues you're talking about. Probably to keep this discussion a bit narrow, we probably need to tighten it down. What is clear at the moment is that the legislation, at least the funding model for NZ On Air, is very broadcasting centric. So there are other challenges you talk about. Who's next?
Ron Goodfellow from Farmside.
Sorry, I was waiting so long, Ron.
I just want to take up Paul's point again, is that basically telcos are looking to have access to content to deliver over their distribution network. Well, if we just look to the UK, you'll see that that's been solved. That's been solved by British Telecom buying content, football games, against Sky. So as long as there's a fair playing field in the actual acquisition of the content, then surely this is a no-brainer. Just wouldn't mind people's comments on that.
So therefore don't need regulation in that space?
Well, I suppose in New Zealand there's one majority player, which is Sky. So as long as a bigger player, as big as Sky can stand up to it, then there'll be a fair market. But I suppose there isn't at the moment, and that's what's worrying.
Yep.
Michael, I think there's an issue with this idea that ISPs should pay for content. My personal wish is to see ISPs as stupid as possible, and that they don't try and become pseudo-television broadcasters or pseudo-HBOs. Because we had a conference here yesterday called INTAC, the Internet Technical Architecture Conference. And there was a guy there from Telecom who got a bit sort of pulled apart on the stage. And he was like, well, we want content providers to pay us for our pipes. You know, those dirty Googles and, Apples, they're letting people download stuff over our network. We want them to pay us. Like, well, hang on a minute. I'm your customer. I'm paying you. I expect to get access to content on the internet, notwithstanding your stupid data cap. So I don't want to see Telecom buying rights to sports stuff, but I do want to see a kind of market evolve where there is a range of content that is available for us to get online. And I think that comes right back to your slide, which was the boot of Sky on the UFB. Because if we don't have competitive markets in, say, content, and say a firm like Sky locks up a whole bunch of rights, and I'm really glad the Commerce Commission is, in fact, investigating content rights purchasing by Sky at the moment, then we'll have a situation where people don't have choice, and the content is locked up and not available. But I don't think the solution for that is like Telecom bidding against Sky for the Olympics and trying to broadcast it. If you've ever met people from Telecom, you don't want Telecom becoming a TV broadcaster. It's not what they're good at, any more than you want TVNZ becoming an ISP. So, it isn't necessary under convergence for these companies to all turn into converged versions of each other. But what is important is that we get the markets regulated and working right, so there's competition at each level.
Yep. So I really welcome your comment, thanks. Thanks, Jordan, and also yours before, because as a room we probably tend towards the idea that these nasty, bloody, big outfits like Telecom, Sky, etc. should be regulated. But, it ain't that simple, as you point out. So that little boxing match that was going on before then, that goes on at a fairly rudimentary sort of, soundbite level. And, in the UK, two things have happened there which are really important. The Competition Commission, a regulator, has said it's okay, we don't need to regulate. And then, of course, subsequently what's happened is that BT stepped in and bought some, what are regarded as absolutely prime rights for pay TV, or for TV generally, which is FA Cup or All Blacks or whatever. There's signs that the market is working there. And the way I see it is that we should have a regulator who systematically, on a principle basis, looks at these things and comes to views. And they may well decide in New Zealand, I don't know what the answer is, that it's like in the UK, that actually you don't need regulation. It just needs a careful review.
I think in the absence of any regulation whatsoever, I think there's a risk of some unintended consequences, and that is that the internet may split into two classes. The first class internet, where people have, content providers have reached an agreement with an ISP, and the second class internet, where the quality of service is much worse, that carries all of the other content where they may not want to pay, or where they actually want to have open access to content. So I think there's actually a risk. If anyone has any
A risk in the marketplace.
a risk in the market that consumers will if you go with ISP A, then you get primary access to content providers A, B and
Yep.
C, but you cannot get good access to content provider D unless you're with a ISP E.
I'd like to make a point that the Sky boot situation is also part of this rooted multi-point, which is a controlled access, if you like, towards garden. And the open access is a different type of technology. So they will be able to exclude everybody. Rooted multicast will exclude everybody that they don't have content agreements with. And so the rest of the market will be pushed into the open access multicast, multipoint to multipoint. But at least there will be diversity, and the ecology of the information system and the knowledge system will be at least more open than being controlled by a rooted multipoint.
Thank you.
I just briefly I think that there's a problem with regulation and competition in New Zealand in general, which applies to convergence just as much as it applies to anything else, and that is one of scale. One of the reasons why the solution of someone bidding against Sky doesn't work in New Zealand is that there's really no interest in large internet companies in really transacting inside New Zealand much at all. It's not a big enough market to be of any interest to them. So, and in that respect, I think that our competition law, to the extent that we attempt to try and follow models which are either Australian or American or British, fails to take cognizance of the fact that our market is just too small for those sorts of rationales to really work here.
Yep.
Just speaking to your two-class of internet comment before, and also to yours about the scale. Yesterday, again, there was a good presentation by Dean Pemberton. I'm not sure if he's in the room, but he was basically arguing for aggregation of our content via Australia. So the core of his argument is we shouldn't be laying another pipe to LA via Pacific Fibre. We should be laying 3 or 4 to Australia, because we need to scale and aggregate our demand as a nation for these content providers so that we're actually represented. And the best way to do that is via Australia. We've already outsourced our defence force to them effectively, so why not our content relationships, which I think is the soundbite he had. Going back to your two-class of internet comment, I think we're already there. I mean, if you look at the broadband market in New Zealand, we already have zero-rated content, which effectively is a competition issue. The minute you have zero-rated sites versus rated sites, you've gone to two classes of internet. If you can get content from MySky for free versus going to a VPN server using Netflix, then you'll use MySky because it doesn't cost you. So we're already in that reality.
Thank you.
Just a question about competition again. It's still a bit bizarre for me to hear that just two people can make a competition when competition was at least heralded originally as a multiplayer, a seriously multiplayer sort of market in which lots of things are happening, and somehow or other you got a good deal out of it. I'm a bit jaded at hearing that two very big players equal competition. I think it's much more about antitrust rather than competition. A question about affordability, really. If you have sort of neutral pipe and content, and you keep them separate, is it still affordable the way pipe's supplied in New Zealand? Is it affordable for for content providers in greater diversity than at the moment to produce for that form of distribution?
Yep. Classic part of the analysis of these things is a small country like this, can we afford multiple players, more than one UFB, etc., or less? Any other comments? So putting this neutrally, who, in terms of having in the competition space, who thinks that it's a good idea that a regulator is there that covers the field, media, telco, broadcasting, same sort of principles? And otherwise, good on you. Do you want to say why, or? So anyone can do anything? Why do we need regulation? Yeah. Which is a common and legitimate view. No, let's not rule that out. It's all very well for regulatory wonks like me to think it's a cool idea, but sometimes what you say is, I might not agree, but could be right. And on the point before about two different classes of service, paid for and not paid for, that's a bit of a complicated thing as well, because most of us will actually pay more money to get a better service. So why wouldn't we do that? And so that whole net neutrality debate is not a simple one.
Well, listening to the debate, one of the things it seems is we're trying to wonder whether we should regulate or not what we have as existing institutions. And I want to throw the picture open and say perhaps what convergence really means is that we actually are in the stage of re-evolving some of our institutions, and we actually don't know where they're going to go. And so perhaps we need to have a more of an open agenda as to what may evolve.
So don't regulate.
I didn't say don't regulate. I just think that we need to actually we need to be aware of a wider evolving of our institutions within its relationship to convergence. And maybe we need to frame how we cope with that a little bit differently rather than just saying we have existing structures and we got a little bit of abuse here and a little bit of vulnerability over there, and how do we cope? Because there's a bigger picture going on.
Yep. So there is a huge danger in stepping in to regulate too quickly.
I think it's very important to frame the real nature of the problem.
Yep. And reading, Amy Adams when she became the Minister of something or other, when she talked about regulation of the space, I really think this was misread by some people. At least I'm reading it this way, and I'm right, I reckon. But she didn't say, I ain't going to regulate. She said, look, I'm going to see how it plays out over the next year or two, and if I don't like what's happening, I'll regulate. It's pretty well what she said. It's your point. See how it plays. It's a moving feast. If you're not doing too flash, I'll regulate. And that's kind of, ministerial speak for, I'm watching people see how they play in the sandpit. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to step in. Regulatory forbearance, and that's entirely legitimate. And the uncertainty, we don't know where we're going. Two examples at the start of the session. One extremely experienced person saying, essentially, the people from centre, the broadcasters are going to rule the coop, and another one saying, well, no, that's not the case at all. New entrants are going to come in. I mean, what's going to happen over the next year or two? We can put in place policy settings and absolutely screw it up. I'm trying to be as neutral as I can here. I do have views about this. I still think there should be a regulator.
But Michael, isn't one of the first problems, I'm talking too much, I'll try and be quick, that there just isn't enough solid information on the ground? And so one of the things that would be really good would be to have a regulator. Pamela, in her speech this morning, said that the FCC has 1,700 people. Federal Trade Commission has 1,700 people. I don't know how many the FCC has. I think it's bigger. And how many people that work on telco in the Commerce Commission? It's like 40 people.
Yep.
And that's just telco. So one of the good things that might be an evolution of the institutions is having a regulator, either in the Commission or elsewhere, that at least had the power to investigate these things and give us, require data to be provided by providers and actually publish information on which we could start to have the debate. Because to be honest, other than instinct and anecdote and observed facts, the data just isn't there.
Yeah, and a whole card, a practical example of that is the recent demand side study by the Commission. And the poor quality of that report, I guess, comes back to, there's capable people there. The poor quality, I think, probably comes back to lack of resourcing. And it's unfortunate because I think it takes us steps back where there's some conclusions drawn which are debatable, fairly brief, and that's unfortunate. It'd be far better. We've got a lot at stake in this thing. It's kind of worth hundreds of millions or billions or whatever to the economy, is to put a real effort into it, and a proper regulator is likely to do that. But I emphasise the poor quality, I think, is down to the lack of resource at the Commission.
Can I pick you up on that demand-side study? I'm not.
Oh shit! Did you write it? Because
no, I didn't. But I also am very aware that a lot of people who are outside the major telco and content industries weren't consulted about it. So there was no choice for the garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
That Amy, whoever she is, might really be producing an anti-sound bubble.
Might be what, sorry?
Producing an eminently reasonable but anti-sound bubble.
Well, she's a National Party person. Of course she's eminently reasonable. Amy, whatever her name is. Don't you think? Jacinda, Claire? Just
briefly, there's convergence in another sense as well. So there's public broadcasting, and then there's commercial activity on the web. One of the key issues which is happening in the online content industry is that all the advertising revenue is now all being earned offshore. So it's no longer available for the production or the support of content, period, in New Zealand. That's linked inevitably to public broadcasting policy and also to regulatory policy. And we really need to get Craig Foss and Amy Adams and various other people in a room together and discuss the overall issue of not just content, but culture and the impact on those issues which convergence or the internet is having at a sort of a key level. Because, the most obvious thing that's happening right now is that Freeview is being kneecapped by the government because they don't like TVNZ very much, they don't like public broadcasting. and at the same time, Sky's being allowed to I don't know, spend another couple of years monopolising us before we figure out whether or not to regulate them. And TVNZ's being forced to go into cap in hand to Igloo, when Sky should be being forced to pay to carry the public broadcasting channels via their network. I mean, there's an elephant in the room which is kind of blindingly obvious from a regulatory standpoint, which exists in most markets where they have strong pay TV monopolies. I mean, why don't we just do that?
Yes, well, returning to the theme of this, which is globalisation, we are out of step with the rest of the OECD world in terms of not having regulation in the space. So, but, you know, okay, go and talk to Amy Adams. I mean, where the hell's that going to get people? What's going to happen? But maybe things have I come back to the point before about things have a natural cycle about them. You know, with telecom and operational separation, they admitted themselves, they just pushed the boundaries too far, and they went past the point of no return. They pissed off Helen Clark, they didn't introduce something they said they're going to do, and then it got to the point of no return, and the outrageously extraordinary remedy of operational separation was put in place, which is quite disastrous for them and has actually led to the current situation. But that all happened because they pushed it, a monopoly that got quite self-confident, and they pushed it. It's interesting watching Sky at the moment. Very, very smart, very capable operators, but they're doing some footfalls. This whole business about ISPs and locking them into the content thing looks like it's a footfall. I don't know enough about it to know, but maybe those footfalls kind of expedite it. And now we've got the press. The press, of course, has been onto this, looking at it closely. The Commission's looking at this issue and so on and so forth. But what else it takes to do something, I don't know. But ain't going to happen quick. But within 2 or 3 years, I'll bet a bottle of Moe on it.
I wouldn't guarantee that 2 or 3 years that the cycle will come back. There's no guarantee. We've got to make it work.
Are you betting with me?
I'll take you up on that.
Right.
Why not? I think
Magnum.
Oh, right. Fair enough. That way, I'll win either way. I think Amy Adams and Craig Foss meet regularly in Cabinet, but the problem is Stephen Joyce is in the same room with them to put a stop to any kind of non-commercial or public broadcasting. What I was going to say is, what is the benefit of competition? With regulation, I mean, if you're regulating to create a competitive environment, why? Why is competition going to work in New Zealand? It doesn't seem to work in so many industries. And if you look at the price of milk, we pay, we have competition, but it's only 2 or 3 providers, and we pay heaps. And that is repeated elsewhere in various industries. What does competition actually give us? Perhaps the solution is that we actually just regulate the price.
Thank you. Wrap-up time, so I will summarise very quickly. You stand up and you walk outside and get afternoon tea. Thanks so much.